Last year, we did a video on subordinate sentence clauses in German. That was episode 8. And specifically, the focus on that episode was to talk about the word order changes that happen in subordinate sentence clauses in German, because it can seem very strange when you're coming to that from English for the first time. Now, in this episode, I'd like to do a follow-up of sorts to talk about a specific type of subordinate sentence clause called a relative clause. And specifically, I want to talk about the relative pronouns that we use to introduce these clauses. The concept of relative sentence clauses is very similar across English and German, but the pronouns that we use to introduce these clauses are very different. Now, why would you want to learn this? This is something that is relatively easy to learn that can greatly improve how natural your language comes across. Instead of speaking in short, robotic, self-contained sentences, you can combine those sentences together to form sentences that come across much more naturally. So, let's talk about relative sentence clauses and relative sentence pronouns in English and German and see how the two languages contrast and compare. From beautiful Banff National Park in Western Canada, this is Lernen und Fahren. So what is a relative clause? What does that mean? Well, a relative clause is a specific type of subordinate sentence clause that provides more information about something introduced in the main clause. Now, the something for which we are providing more information is referred to as the antecedent. Now, usually the antecedent is a specific noun in the main clause. Not always, though. Sometimes, as we'll see in later examples, the antecedent is not specifically defined in the main clause. But we'll get to that. Let's start with English. It turns out there are a ton of relative pronouns that we can use to introduce a relative sentence clause. I'm not going to cover every single one of these. I'm just going to zoom in and focus on some of the more commonly used ones in English, just to give you a reminder of how this works in English. So, the ones we're going to look at are who, whom, which, that, and whose. I'm going to kind of gloss over the other ones. So the first thing we'll notice in English is that we distinguish between an antecedent that is a living being, like a person, versus an antecedent that is an inanimate object. We have to choose between who or which. So for example, the person who owns that motorcycle is happy. The motorcycle which I want to buy is expensive. Okay, you wouldn't say the person which owns that motorcycle, and you wouldn't say the motorcycle who I want to buy. Those sound backwards because we differentiate in English between living being antecedents and inanimate antecedents. It turns out there's a cheat code you can use in English to get around that if you can't remember it. And that is, you can just substitute in the word that. So the person that owns that motorcycle is happy, great. The motorcycle that I want to buy is expensive. Those both mean the same. It's just a slightly easier way of phrasing it. We don't have to distinguish in that case. Now, the relative pronoun can serve different functions in the relative sentence clause. It can act as the subject of the relative clause, as we've seen in those two examples, or the object of the relative clause, or as the object of a preposition in the relative clause, or with a possessive. Let's look at each one with examples. What happens when we change from the relative pronoun being the subject of a sentence to being the object of a sentence? For example, here comes the girl whom I like. Okay, we switched from who to whom there. Why? Well, I don't want to get too mired down in this debate. This is kind of a tired debate in English. There are a lot of people who think that the word whom should be retired from modern English because it's basically obsolete at this point. Honestly, who knows the difference between who and whom anymore? For technical accuracy, who is a subject pronoun and whom is an object pronoun. So the way to tell which one you're supposed to use is to extract that subordinate clause and phrase it as a standalone sentence. So, here comes the girl whom I like. Whom I like is not a complete sentence, but we can rephrase it with a personal pronoun. Now, you wouldn't say in English, I like she. Why? Well, she is a subject pronoun, and it just doesn't fit in that sentence. You would say, I like her. Her is an object pronoun, therefore, the relative pronoun that we reach for in English is whom, not who. But, I mean, having said that, does anybody care? I mean, only the strictest of grammar purists is going to give you a hard time for using who instead of whom. Is it really wrong in modern English to say, here comes the girl who I like? It's pretty much the same thing these days. And if it really bugs you and you can't remember which one to use, again, you've got that cheat code. In English, you can just reach for the word that. Here comes the girl that I like means exactly the same thing. And because that can serve either as a subject pronoun or an object pronoun, you don't have to know how you're using it. You can just use it, which is kind of nice. For inanimate objects, we stick with the word which. There goes the car which I was talking about. You can also say, of course, there goes the car that I was talking about. It means the same thing. All right. I will quickly point out that in English, sometimes you can drop the relative pronoun from the relative clause without changing the meaning. This is kind of weird, but you can say, for example, here comes the girl whom I like. You can say, here comes the girl that I like. Or in English, you can also just say, here comes the girl I like. You don't have to use the relative pronoun there, it's optional. But I will point out that this option does not exist in German. In German, the relative pronoun cannot be omitted from the sentence. They're pretty strict about that. Okay, so how about using the relative pronoun as the object of a preposition in the relative clause? How does that work? Well, it gets a little wonky here in English because we have this construct called a dangling preposition. You can say, this is the person for whom I am waiting. You can also say, this is the person whom I am waiting for. That for is a preposition, and it can, in this case, get thrown to the end of the relative clause. Usually the preposition goes before its object, but here it's perfectly valid in English. And I mean, again, some grammar purists will say that you shouldn't do this, you shouldn't end a sentence with a preposition, it's bad form, but it's perfectly acceptable in modern English. So we have three options in English to say that. You can say, this is the person for whom I am waiting, this is the person whom I am waiting for with a dangling preposition, or you can omit the relative pronoun, you can say, this is the person I am waiting for. Okay. I will point out, again, that this concept of a dangling preposition does not exist in German. There is no such thing, as far as I know, as a dangling preposition in German. That's an English thing. So only one of those can be expressed in German, as we'll see when we get to the German section. And again, for inanimate objects, we stick with the word which. So that is the car which I was talking about. That is the car about which I was talking. Or you can just say, that is the car I was talking about. Three options. Okay, let's talk about the possessive. Possessive relative pronouns in English are super duper easy. It's just the word whose. The word whose doesn't care about plurality. It doesn't even care about living beings versus inanimate objects. We don't make that distinction here. So that is the person whose cat is nice. That is the house whose roof is old. Works either with living beings or inanimate objects. There's another construct for that in English, but it's a little bit wonky. It uses the word of. You can say, that is the house, the roof of which is old. Okay, but that's a bit stuffy, so let's move on. Okay, that's enough about English. Yes, there's more to it than that in English. I'm not going to go into every nook and cranny for the sake of time. This is just a quick refresher of how it works. In case you haven't thought about this stuff since you were back in school, there's a quick refresher of how it works in English. Okay, great. Let's move on to German. Kind of a good news, bad news situation here in German. The good news is that in German, they don't care about differentiating between living beings and inanimate objects. That's not a distinction that they make when looking at the antecedent in German. That's kind of nice. The bad news here is that the Germans, for whatever reason, decided to reuse their definite articles as relative pronouns. This is either horrible or kind of helpful, depending on how you look at it. I'm kind of torn between the two. Maybe it's a little bit of both. It's horrible because we have the same words that we've seen elsewhere in German that we already kind of know what they mean. Now we see them with the same spelling and the same pronunciation, but a completely different meaning. So when you see one of these words in a sentence, you've got to parse out the context in which it is used in order to understand what it means. This can be very frustrating at first, but push through because there is a silver lining on this cloud. The good news here is that the declension table for relative pronouns in German mostly follows the declension table that you already know, or that you're already probably familiar with by this point in your German studies. You've already seen how the word the definite article in German, undergoes declension in different cases. The relative pronouns here are extremely similar. There's just a couple of exceptions which we'll cover. So, let's look at some examples. I will point out that the relative pronoun in German, the grammatical gender and the plurality of it are driven by the antecedent. So if your antecedent is grammatically feminine and singular, say, then you will reach for a grammatically feminine singular relative pronoun. Okay? The case of the relative pronoun is determined by how it's used in the sentence. Now, just like in English, the relative pronoun in German can either serve as the subject of the relative clause, or the direct object, the indirect object, the object of a preposition, or the possessive. Let's look at each one with examples. So, relative pronoun as the subject of a clause. This is nominative case in German. Our example in English was, the person who owns this motorcycle is happy. Die Person, die das Motorrad besitzt, ist glücklich. Wait, what? Did you say die das Motorrad? Doesn't that mean the motorcycle? No, we gotta be careful here. Let's take a look at this sentence. Notice how the word die shows up twice. It shows up at the beginning of the sentence. Die Person, that's the definite article. The person. Okay, great, no problem. The second usage of die is not the definite article. This is a relative pronoun. It translates to English as who. The person who owns this motorcycle. Why is it die though? It's die because the antecedent is die Person, which is singular and grammatically feminine. So we look into our declension table and we pick the singular, grammatically feminine, nominative, relative pronoun, which is die. It matches the definite article that we use with the antecedent, which is kind of nice. Let's look at other grammatical genders. What if we changed to masculine? Another way to say die Person in German is der Mensch. It means the same thing, but notice it's grammatically masculine. What does that do to our sentence? Specifically, what does that do to our relative pronoun? Der Mensch, der das Motorrad besitzt, ist glücklich. Okay, die changed to der to match the definite article that we're using with the antecedent. Great. What if it was grammatically neuter? I don't know when you would ever say this in German, but how about the being who owns that motorcycle is happy? The being in German is das Wesen. It's grammatically neuter. Das Wesen, das das Motorrad besitzt, ist glücklich. Now we've got das there. That looks and sounds kind of odd, but it makes perfect sense when you parse it out. The first das is the relative pronoun. It means who. The second das means the motorcycle. So we see that the relative pronoun in the nominative is basically just the definite article that goes with the antecedent. But what if the antecedent doesn't have a definite article? Well, just think of what definite article you would use if it was there. For example, Leute, die laut sind, gehen mir auf die Nerven. People who are loud get on my nerves. Notice that we didn't use the definite article in front of Leute. We just said Leute, not die Leute. But that die is kind of implied because it's plural. So the relative pronoun there is also die. In the nominative case, you just use the definite article that matches the antecedent. Easy. Now, if you're confused by the word order there, notice that in the subordinate clause, the conjugated verb gets pushed to the end. That was covered in episode 8. I'm not going to go over that again in this episode. I refer you back to episode 8. If that has thrown you for a loop, go watch that episode and come back here, and this will make a lot more sense. All right, let's move on to accusative. What if we're using the relative pronoun as the direct object of the sentence? Of the relative clause, I mean. Der ist der Mann, den ich kenne. Okay, der changed to den for the relative pronoun. Why? He is the man whom I know. It changed in German for the same reason that who changes to whom in English. Again, extract that subordinate clause. In English, you wouldn't say, I know he, for the same reason that in German you wouldn't say, ich kenne er. He und er are subject pronouns. What we need there to make that sentence sound right is an object pronoun. In English, you would say, I know him. So the relative pronoun that we reach for in English is whom. He is the man whom I know. In German, ich kenne ihn. Ihn is an object pronoun. So the relative pronoun that we reach for there in our declension table is singular, grammatically masculine, accusative case, that is den. Er ist der Mann, den ich kenne. Okay, got it. What about dative case? Dative case is always kind of confusing coming from English. Das ist die Person, mit der ich rede. That is the person with whom I am talking. Again, the antecedent is grammatically feminine and singular. This is in the dative case because of mit. Mit is a dative preposition, so we look into our declension table and we pick out der. If we change that to das ist der Mensch, mit dem ich rede, that is the person with whom I am speaking. When we switch from grammatically feminine to grammatically masculine, we switch from der to dem in the dative case. Okay, the wonky one here is plural because we have to learn a new word, that is denen. Das sind die Leute, mit denen ich rede. These are the people with whom I am speaking. Notice how in English, whom doesn't care about plurality. That is the person with whom I am speaking. These are the people with whom I am speaking. With whom doesn't change in English. But in German it does. Because in German, declension is more complex than English, almost always. And this is no exception. Okay, And that brings us to what if we use the relative pronoun as the object of a preposition in the relative clause. This is where we have to be a little bit careful because, again, there are options in English that don't translate literally into German. For example, that is the person for whom I am waiting. Das ist die Person, auf die ich warte. Notice that auf, the preposition, must come before the relative pronoun. Die, auf die ich warte, for whom I am waiting. In English, we've got a couple extra options. You can say whom I am waiting for. That doesn't exist in German. And in English, you can drop the relative pronoun there. That is the person I am waiting for. That is also not an option in German. The relative pronoun is mandatory, and the preposition must come before the relative pronoun. Okay, let's talk about the possessive. Man, that's a nice view. Now, the possessive in German is more complex than English. In English, remember, it's just the word whose. It doesn't care about plurality. It doesn't really care about much of anything. It's just whose. In German, we have to learn a couple new words. These are dessen und deren. Dessen for grammatically masculine, singular antecedents, or for grammatically neuter, singular antecedents, and deren for grammatically feminine antecedents, or for plural antecedents. Okay, so hier ist Heinrich, dessen Auto kaputt ist. Here is Heinrich, whose car is broken. We use dessen there to mean whose. Das sind die Leute, deren Autos gestohlen wurden. Those are the people whose cars were stolen. Again, in English, notice that whose doesn't change to show plurality, but in German it does. It changes from dessen to deren. Now, I will take a quick sidetrack here to point out that there are a couple of other usages of dessen und deren in German that are kind of interesting. One is to greatly increase the formality of a sentence. For example, der König und seine Familie. Another way to say that in German is der König und dessen Familie. This is much more formal and deferential, and this probably won't come up too often, maybe not ever, in casual German conversations, but you may see it in if you're reading old German stories or whatever. It means the same thing, it's just much more formal. Another usage of dessen und deren is to disambiguate lists of things. We have this problem in English too, but the Germans have come up with a kind of a unique way of solving it. For example, in both languages, it's possible to phrase something in an ambiguous way. For example, Heinrich and Karl arrived in his car. Heinrich und Karl sind mit seinem Auto angekommen. Who does his or seinem refer to in that sentence? Who does the car belong to? Well, I don't know. There's not enough information in that sentence to parse that out. Now, in both languages, you can switch to a proper possessive to disambiguate. You can say Heinrich and Karl arrived in Heinrich's car. Okay, now I know who the car belongs to. Same option exists in German. Heinrich und Karl sind mit Heinrichs Auto angekommen. In German, you also have the option of using dative to show possession. Heinrich und Karl sind mit dem Auto von Heinrich angekommen. Means the same thing, but there's another option in German that involves dessen, and it's kind of weird. We can say Heinrich und Karl sind mit dessen Auto angekommen, and now we know that the car unambiguously belongs to Karl. Wait, what? How do we know that? It could be either of them, right? No. This gets a little weird. Bear with me. Dessen und deren, when they're used to disambiguate a list of things, they refer backwards in the sentence to the most recently mentioned thing. So we know that the car cannot belong to Heinrich because Karl is mentioned more recently in the sentence relative to the word dessen than Heinrich is. What? I know, that's very arbitrary, but there it is. You will see that occasionally in German, and it's good to know what that means when you see it. If dessen disambiguates a list of things, it's referring to the most recent thing in that list. Okay, back to the main track. In both languages, it's possible that the antecedent is not a specific noun in the main clause. The antecedent may be instead a concept or an idea that is discussed in the main clause, or you could think of it as like the antecedent is the main clause itself. For example, Kristen hat mich eingeladen, was ich nett gefunden habe. Kristen invited me, which I thought was nice. The antecedent of which in English, or was in German, is not a specific noun in the main clause. Rather, it's basically the entire main clause itself. The fact that Kristen invited me is what I'm referring back to there. In English, note that we treat that as an inanimate object because an idea or a concept is not a living being. So we use which as our relative pronoun. You wouldn't use who there because it would sound wrong. In German, the indeterminate relative pronoun is usually was. Okay. Let's talk about the placement of the relative clause inside the sentence. Usually, not always, but usually the relative pronoun wants to come directly after the antecedent. So sometimes this means the relative clause comes after the main clause. So that is the motorcycle that I want to buy. Das ist das Motorrad, das ich kaufen will. We've got main clause followed by relative clause. Great. Occasionally you can flip that around. You can say that the relative clause should come before the main clause. So for example, was uns gesagt hat, ist nicht wahr. What he told us isn't true. In both languages, you've got the option to reword that to change the order of the clauses. It isn't true what he told us. In German, you can say, es ist nicht wahr, was uns gesagt hat. They mean the same thing, we're just playing with the order of the clauses relative to one another. Okay. Now, sometimes in German, you can start a relative clause with the word wer. Wer literally means who, but be careful here. When wer starts a sentence, usually in German, that means it's a question. For example, wer ist das? Who is that? Wer ist hier verantwortlich? Who is responsible here? But sometimes you'll see wer start a sentence that isn't a question. It's a statement. In that case, you're probably looking at a relative clause. And in that case, it probably doesn't translate to English as who, but rather whoever. For example, wer mit uns kommen will, muss sich beeilen. Whoever wants to come with us should hurry up. You wouldn't use who there because it would sound weird in English. Who wants to come with us should hurry up. But, interesting historical side note, in older English, this was an option, and it was closer in older English to German than it is in modern English. For example, in Old English you could say, he who wants to come with us should hurry up. He is the antecedent, and who is the relative pronoun. We don't do that in modern English. The main clause there is, he should hurry up, and the relative clause is, who wants to come with us. And in fact, in very old English, you could say it in that order. You could say, he should hurry up, who wants to come with us. That's very antiquated in modern English. We don't say it that way anymore. We don't even say he, who in English anymore, because even that sounds kind of weird. We just go with whoever in modern English. So, wer mit uns kommen will is whoever wants to come with us. Okay, so the relative clause can come after the main clause, or it can come before the main clause. Great, no surprises. There's a third option in both languages, and it's a little bit wonky. The relative clause can show up right in the middle of the sentence. If remember that the relative pronoun wants to come right after the antecedent. But what if the antecedent isn't at the end of the main clause? What if it's in the middle of the main clause? Well, for example, you might say, the test that the students passed was hard. Die Prüfung, die die Studenten bestanden haben, war hart. The antecedent is the test, and it shows up in the middle of the main clause. So what we do is we split the main clause right down the middle, and we divide it into two chunks. And then the relative clause goes right in between those two chunks. This is kind of wonky, but it works the same in both languages. Now, if you have watched episode 8, and you're looking at that sentence and you're thinking, something about that sentence seems just a little bit familiar to me. Maybe not that specific sentence, but the structure of that sentence. Let's revisit something called the verb, comma, verb rule. We discussed this at length in episode 8. Basically, just a very quick recap. Subordinate clauses in German end with a verb. Why? Because the conjugated verb gets pushed to the end. If that means that if the subordinate clause is not at the end of the sentence, but rather at the beginning of the sentence, or in this case, in the middle of the sentence, what you end up with is a clause that ends with a verb followed by a comma. And according to the verb, comma, verb rule, the very next word, the very first word in the next clause, or the very next word in the sentence also has to be a verb. Why? Because that's how German sentences are structured. Verb, comma, verb. So, wer mit uns kommen will, muss sich beeilen. You get that will, comma, muss, because the relative clause starts the sentence. But this also happens if the relative clause shows up in the middle of the sentence. This is another application of the verb, comma, verb rule, which we first discussed way back in episode 8. For example, der Mann, der da drüben steht, ist mein Vater. You get that steht, comma, ist. Die Person, die ich kenne, finde ich ganz nett. You get that kenne, comma, finde. Verb, comma, verb. Die Hunde, die nett sind, spielen da drüben. You get that sind, comma, spielen. Verb, comma, verb. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Yes, I know we didn't go into every single nook and cranny, but for time reasons, I wanted this episode to be short and punchy. So I hope that this gives you a good overview of what you're up against with relative clauses. And specifically, I hope that this episode has helped you to understand that relative sentence clauses are not that difficult in the grand scheme of things, I mean, compared to the rest of the language, it's not that difficult to learn. It's something that you can learn relatively easily that can have a major positive impact on how naturally your sentences come across in German. And I hope that this information is useful to you and helps you to sound more natural in your target language. So there you go. As always, if you have any feedback about this episode or ideas or requests, things that you'd like to see covered in future episodes, either post them in the comments down below or use the anonymous email feedback link on the bottom of the website. I will make every reasonable effort to fulfill those requests in future videos. That's all for now. We will see you next time on Lernen und Fahren.